Those of you who've joined us in person for Summit know how hard it is to get a seat in this next session, but this year you have the best seat in the house. Over the years, our partners at NBCU have joined us during the Workplace Summit to discuss issues central to our community. I am thrilled to welcome our friends at the NBCU News Group to share more about LGBTQ+ issues in America through the lens of the law and Supreme Court.
Hello, Out and Equal. My name is Shepard Smith. I'm the anchor of the News with Shepard Smith on CNBC, which I hope you will watch Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock Eastern Time, first in business worldwide. Welcome to our NBC News Group Summit on covering the Supreme Court of the United States and LGBTQ issues in America. Today's session is going to have two parts. First, a discussion with my esteemed colleague Pete Williams, NBC News Justice Correspondent, about the Supreme Court. We'll look back at the really consequential rulings of 2021 and ahead toward future rulings on the horizon and how they'll impact our friends and family in the LGBTQ community. After that, join us for a roundtable discussion with Candace Gibson, anchor at MSNBC, as he interviews Brooke Sapelsa and Joe Yerkeba of NBC Out as they discuss their coverage of LGBTQ America for NBCnews.com and major stories and trends from this year and beyond. That's a conversation you won't want to miss. Thanks again to Out and Equal for having us, and to NBC News Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team for producing this session. We hope you enjoy. Joining me now is Pete Williams, NBC News Justice Correspondent, covering the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Supreme Court. Pete, it's an honor. It's good to have you here.
My pleasure.
I want to say this before we get started. There was a time for a number of decades when I worked across the street from 30 Rock, and whenever something was breaking in justice or at the Supreme Court, I always told my team, watch the monitor, let's see what Williams says.
And then do the opposite.
No, because if there is anyone who's going to get it exactly right every time for all the decades I've been in this business, it's you, and you're a testament to journalism, and especially justice and Supreme Court journalism, and it's great to be on your team.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you so much.
And honest, very honest. First and foremost, Pete, this pandemic. I want to know what it's been like to cover the Supreme Court in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, we all remember everyone sprinting out of the court with papers and rulings and screaming on cell phones outside the steps. That went completely away. What does your job look like now?
Yeah, no sprinting outside the court because you can't get into the court since March 2020 when the building was shut down. Orders and decisions have been posted online. Oral argument has been conducted by telephone conference call with the justices taking turns, starting with the chief and proceeding by seniority. And by the way, that's been a boon for fans of Clarence Thomas, who seldom asked questions in the past when the justices were in the courtroom, but now he's become a regular and incisive questioner. But it is harder to get a sense of the court's direction when there's no give and take among the justices. You have to remember that oral argument is actually the first time the justices have actually discussed a case together. Now, they will be back in the courtroom come the first Monday in October, the traditional opening date, but with no public attendance, and that means that the live audio will continue. And the court said just yesterday that the questioning will include time for each justice taking a turn going by seniority. So it's been a very different experience. The only exercise we get now, we don't run out of the courtroom anymore. We just sit at our computer and repeatedly hit the refresh button.
There's so much more to it than that, and I know it, because anytime there's a big breaking story, we want to know who's the accused criminal, what's going to happen on the court. You always seem to have that source almost always first of who it is with the accurate information. Has that always been a matter of working the phones and developing sources, or how have you been able to do that over the years?
Well, you're very kind. The Supreme Court is not really a source beat. It's true that covering the Justice Department, you do work your sources, but you don't at the Supreme Court. It's a firing offense for the clerks to talk to journalists. You know, it's a great equalizer. We can all see the cases bubbling up from the lower courts. We can all read the petitions to the court to take the case. We can all listen to the oral argument. We can all read the same decisions. So it's a very different, you know, they say in Washington that reporters take on the characteristics of the beats that they cover. At the Supreme Court, it is very collegial. When we were still in the courtroom, after we'd hear argument, we'd all go down to the press room and say, well, what do you think that question by Justice Breyer meant? It is a different experience covering the court because we're basically all kind of on the same level. And the art, I guess, of covering the court is which cases do you emphasize and how do you explain them?
I want to get to some specific cases, but before we do, you mentioned Justice Thomas. It has almost been without fail, with a couple of notable exceptions over the years, that you never heard a thing. What do you think it is about justices working remotely in this new environment that's caused him to be more of a participator and more specifically an inquisitor through the process, something we'd really never seen?
Well, 2 words, Justice Thomas. That's what the Chief Justice says when he's running the conference. After he asks the questions, then Thomas would be next up in seniority. And so Justice Thomas has jumped right in and asked questions. And I think everybody agrees they've been very good questions. You know, Clarence Thomas is a very garrulous person off the bench. If you go see him in his chambers or you listen to him speak at various events, he's a raconteur. He loves to tell stories. But he has said that he thinks that questions in oral argument interrupt the lawyers. Clearly, with this sort of everybody take a turn thing, it's a different world.
Pete, one of the major cases that was decided this year was Fulton versus the city of Pennsylvania versus the city of Philadelphia. Can you give us an explanation of that case and really how the ruling was decided and what it all means?
Yeah, it was a major case. It turned out not to be a major ruling. So here's the background. Catholic Social Services sued when the city of Philadelphia canceled its city contract after the charity said that it wouldn't place foster children with same-sex parents. The charity said that having to abide by the city's non-discrimination law would violate its religious principles. Now, what the case was really about was a 1990 Supreme Court ruling that said there is no religious exemption to neutral laws that apply to everybody. Catholic Social Services was basically asking the Supreme Court to overturn that precedent and say that it could religiously claim to be exempt from the discrimination law. But the court didn't go that far. It did rule for the charity, but in a very narrow way. It found that the city's application of the anti-discrimination law wasn't neutral because it did provide for some exceptions. And so the court said it flunked the test that was laid out in that 1990 ruling. And on that, the vote was 9-0. So a very narrow ruling, limited to the peculiarities of the Philadelphia situation. And the court's 3 most conservative justices, Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, said the court should have overruled that 1990 case, but they didn't carry the day.
So in the main, for all of us who are out and equal, who wonder how that will affect us, the answer is it doesn't.
Right, not much is the answer, yes.
Okay, the case of Arlene's Flowers versus Washington State, it got so much notice. The Supreme Court declined to hear a court case that really could have allowed religious exemptions for anti-LGBTQ plus actions. Is that similar to the cake shop challenge from a few years ago?
Totally. And this was a defeat for the group that were backing that case and backing businesses who claim a religious right to refuse to provide services for same-sex weddings. This is the very question that the court dodged 3 years ago in the case of that masterpiece cake shop, the Colorado man who said that baking a cake to celebrate a same-sex marriage would violate his free expression and his religious beliefs. And then the issue came back in this appeal brought by a Washington State florist. Her name is Baronelle Stutzman. Her business is Arlene Flowers, and she refused to provide flowers for the wedding of 2 longtime male customers. And just like that Colorado baker, she said that her floral arrangements are works of art and that having to create them for same-sex weddings would trample her freedom of expression. She lost in the state courts. This was the 2nd time the Supreme Court declined to take up her case. And on this second go-round, Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch said the court should have taken up her appeal, but again, they didn't carry the day. And by the way, her lawyers are again asking the court to consider her appeal. They came back after the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver ruled in July that a website designer would violate Colorado's non-discrimination law if it refused to do designs that celebrate same-sex weddings. And the florist lawyer said that just shows how much of this area of the law needs to be clarified.
So it sounds as if there could very well be more to come in this particular lane, because there doesn't appear to be a decision.
Absolutely right. These groups will continue to try. So far, they have not gotten traction. Masterpiece Cake Shop the court ruled in his favor, but on a very narrow basis. They basically just said that there was some negative comments from a member of the Colorado Human Rights Commission, but they have refused to answer this big question, which they ducked again in the Philadelphia case about whether there is a religious exemption to abiding by anti-discrimination laws. Do
you know if there are any cases in the lower courts that look like, well, maybe this will rise and maybe we'll get some sort of decision from this, decidedly conservative court?
Well, we'll see. That 10th Circuit case about the web designer, I'm sure that if the web designer loses that case, they will go to the Supreme Court. And of course, the 10th Circuit did rule against the web designer. So unless the full 10th Circuit wants to rehear the case, which I don't think is going to happen, that will undoubtedly be another request for the Supreme Court to take the case. I would be surprised if the court wants to grab onto this issue now when there's so much other stuff coming up in this term.
Stepping away from the journalists, wearing the journalist hat for just a second, and as a matter of observation, this matter of bathrooms and gender it's been a painful discussion for a lot of people who I know and love. And back in June, the Supreme Court also declined to hear a case about a transgender student in bathrooms. Is that the end of the transgender bathroom discussion, legally speaking, or is it possible that more is ahead?
Well, we'll see, and let me explain why I say that. The case you're talking about is the case of Gavin Grimm from Virginia, and like Arlene's Flowers, this was another defeat for the right, and this time only 2 justices voted to take the case, Thomas and Alito, not Gorsuch. So far, every federal appeals court to look at this question has said that refusing to let students use the bathrooms corresponding to their gender identity would violate federal civil rights law. And the Supreme Court ruled 2 years ago that Title VII, the federal civil rights law, bans employment discrimination on the basis of gender identity. That's the decision written by Gorsuch. And now the Biden administration has interpreted that ruling as applying to Title IX, the anti-discrimination law for schools as well. Now, you asked if it could come back, and it could come back to the Supreme Court if one of the appeals courts rules the other way. So far, they've all been in agreement, but there is a Florida case almost identical to the Gavin Grimm case, and a 3-judge panel of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in the students' favor, but now the full appeals court has voted to rehear the case. And when that happens, it wipes out the panel decision. There's also a 9th Circuit case involving the issue of allowing transgender students to play on the school sports teams that match their gender identities. So those cases may be headed to the Supreme Court. I doubt they'll get there in time for this term. And by the way, there's one other transgender case that has actually been sitting on the Supreme Court's doorstep for 1.5 years. This is an appeal brought by a Catholic hospital in California. It was sued after it refused to perform a hysterectomy for a transgender man, and he claimed the hospital violated a state law in California that guarantees full and equal access to public accommodations regardless of sex, gender identity, or gender expression. Those are the terms in the California law. Now that case is at a very early stage procedurally. It involves some state law questions. We assumed the court would decline to take it after it ruled in the Philadelphia case, but it didn't do anything, so it's kind of a mystery why it's still sitting there.
You mentioned the 3-judge panel in Florida, and now the full court will hear it. Based on the makeup of the court in Florida, does it look to Pete Williams like, well, maybe this is one that might rise?
Yes, I think so, because the only reason a court would take a case en banc, the entire appeals court, is if a majority of the court thinks that the panel got it wrong. So for the advocates of transgender rights, this is a bad sign. And if the 11th Circuit did rule the other way than the panel did, then you would have a split in the circuits. Because so far all the circuits have agreed with the people who have brought the transgender lawsuits. So if there was a split, then it would be more likely that the Supreme Court would take the case.
All right, we'll watch it. Abortion rights. I don't remember a time in my lifetime, Pete, where it felt like Roe was under such challenge. But now it clearly is in the state of Texas. The Supreme Court made some really big waves when it refused to block the Texas law that restricted most abortions. And it's also now being asked to overturn Roe v. Wade entirely with this Mississippi abortion case. This Mississippi abortion case was on a lot of people's radar for a long time. The Texas one, for me at least, even as a journalist, it seemed to just pop up out of nowhere. Which will be, that Mississippi one's going to be argued in December. If you could walk us through exactly what this all means.
Okay, well, this is definitely going to be the abortion term. Now, right now, the Texas case is not before the Supreme Court, but it does seem likely that it's going to come back this term for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Justice Department is challenging the law, and that will likely move quickly through the courts on an effort to get an injunction to block enforcement. That's not easy, though, because here's the problem. When courts issue injunctions, what they do is they forbid officials from enforcing the law. But this law in Texas, this SB 8 law, is not enforced by state officials. So who do you enjoin? The justices can't issue rulings that apply to parties that aren't involved in the case. So that's a problem. Or maybe one of these private lawsuits will make it up to the Supreme Court. That could be a slower process, though, because they have to work their way through the state courts.
Before you move on, I want to ask you about those private ones, because this guy in Arkansas who, there was an op-ed placed into the Washington Post, I believe it was, where the doctor admitted, yes, I broke the law. Then the man from Arkansas filed the suit. He has standing because I assume he has standing here, right?
Well, we assume he has standing because the Texas law says anybody can sue.
And as a result, this lawsuit's going forward, and it's clearly a lawsuit that's being filed to test so that this can rise. What's your sense of whether this strategy, and it clearly is one, is going to work?
Well, there are two private lawsuits like that. But here again is the problem. Let's assume that one of these people who sued gets in, and the judge says, well, no, you have no right to bring this lawsuit, or you can't do this because the Supreme Court says that stopping abortion this quickly would be an undue burden. What happens? Then the judge issues an injunction blocking that person from suing anymore. But it doesn't affect the ability of anybody else to sue. Right. I mean, this was the architecture behind this law, was basically to force abortion clinics to keep litigating this over and over and over again and basically, bankrupt them. So until somebody can figure out exactly how to stop not only individual lawsuits, but anybody from suing, or anybody or the state from further carrying out this law, I just don't know how this is going to end up. There's no easy answer here.
All right,
so
now
back
the Mississippi
to Mississippi.
case.
Yeah, okay. So this is a direct attempt to get the Supreme Court to overrule Roe v. Wade, the decision of 48 years ago, and the follow-on rulings that say states can't ban abortion before viability, which is 23 or 24 weeks into the pregnancy. This Mississippi law would ban nearly all abortions after 15 weeks. I think there are three possible outcomes here. One is Mississippi loses. That seems the least likely. I just don't think the votes on the court are there. The second is Mississippi wins whole hog, and the court agrees with the state's claim that Roe has no support in the Constitution, that there is no such thing as a constitutional right to privacy. And I think that also seems unlikely. And that, by the way, is what Mississippi is asking the Supreme Court to do. There was a little bit of bait and switch here. When the state originally brought the lawsuit, they said, you don't have to overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, when they filed their merits briefs, they said, you got to overturn Roe v. Wade. So the third possibility is the court finds some way to avoid overturning Roe and says that banning abortion after 15 weeks is not an undue burden on the right to choose. But of course, if it does that, then what's to stop the court from somebody come along and saying, well, how about after 12 weeks? How about after 8 weeks? Where's the end point? I don't know, but I can't imagine the court just flat goes with Mississippi the whole way.
The word viability is a gray word that both sides pull at.
Yeah, but what Texas says, or I'm sorry, what Mississippi says here is that science has changed since Roe and Casey were decided. The viability age is much earlier. The opponents of the law and many doctors are saying, nope, the human body hasn't changed at all since Roe and Casey, and viability is still roughly 24 weeks.
How did this particular Mississippi challenge come together? There have been attempts by conservatives for ever since Roe v. Wade was enacted, there have been attempts. But this Mississippi case, especially under this current case, is special because, for those of us who aren't as knowledgeable as you, what?
Well, you're right, it was an attempt by the state, and there were many of them. I think this may have been at the head of the line of these recent laws. This was called the Gestational Age Act. And it said you can't perform an abortion after 15 weeks. There's no exception for rape or incest. And of course, the Supreme Court was more receptive to it this time. This is a more conservative court, and they were willing to take the case. Now, the law has been stopped in the lower courts. Both the district judge and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the very conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, basically said to Mississippi, what, are you nuts? You can't block abortion. You can restrict, but you can't block abortion before viability. So this law is clearly unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court has agreed to hear it.
Pete, you mentioned that it's currently a solid conservative majority on the Supreme Court with the appointment of Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. That's without question. But have the rulings given followed the expectation that this would perform as a conservative court?
Well, no, not in every way. I mean, you have to consider some of the big rulings from last term. Remember, the court did not strike down Obamacare. The court did not say that schools have an absolute right to censor punish students for whatever they say, no matter where they are, whether they're on campus or off. Remember, during Amy Coney Barrett, her confirmation hearing, her opponents said, boy, you know, she's going to get on the Supreme Court, and she's on a mission to kill Obamacare, and she will do anything she can to uphold any crazy lawsuit against the election. Neither of those things happened. So there were some liberal victories last year. There were also some conservative ones. It hasn't been as dire as some people predicted, but make no mistake, this is probably the most conservative Supreme Court in a century.
I don't want to talk about the politics of it because that's not your lane, but you wonder, is there a way to get a level of clarity? Is there a way to boost Roe v. Wade? Is there a way to make these challenges stop coming, or is this just how life's going to be while we have a conservative court?
Well, this is how life's going to be because people think, oh boy, now is our chance. Now remember, folks who oppose to abortion have been trying various tactics over the years, and they have finally decided, you know what, let's just drop the pretense. Let's just take a full frontal attack on Roe v. Wade and see where we get. And this is the closest they've ever gotten to what for them is a very important crusade legally. So this is their best chance. We'll just have to see how it comes out. I would be shocked if the Supreme Court is prepared to strike down Roe v. Wade.
I feel like when I was a young journalist many decades ago that when we were studying such matters, the Supreme Court was not treated as a political body at all. I think now most Americans would think of it differently. Is there a way for this court to ever be considered an apolitical body again?
Well, you know, the justices, of course, it's been very interesting to watch in the last couple of weeks, the justices out there defending the court, saying that rulings stem from differences in judicial philosophy, not politics. But it's true the independence is under unusually intense attack. A new poll from Marquette University Law School out this week finds nationwide approval for the court went from 66% a year ago to 49% now, and you see 3 of the justices out there defending the court. I think a lot of people would say, yes, it's probably true that many of these decisions result from differences in judicial philosophy. But I think if you look especially at the court's rulings in the election area, in almost every single case that's come before the court in the last several years, these decisions have tended to help the Republicans, and I think many people think that that's no coincidence.
I want to turn to some questions from our audience, submitted questions from folks here at Out and Equal. First up, Associate Justice Stephen Breyer is facing a lot of calls to retire, but has refused those calls. What are his reasons for not retiring?
I think it's because he wants to stay on the court. Seriously, I think he feels, this is sort of what he has said both in this book that's just out and in a speech that he gave at Harvard in the spring, that if in the course of these calls for him to step down so that the Democratic president and the Democratic Congress can put somebody on the court, that would be basically caving to the criticism that the court is nothing more than junior league politicians. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think a second reason is one that he hasn't expressed, is that he thinks he still has some influence, that he can be a moderating influence on the court that will keep the court from its worst conservative instincts, is probably the way he sees it, and that he has been able to do this in the past, and there's some evidence that he was certainly played a big role the first time the Supreme Court bailed out Obamacare, that he was critical to that, and I think he still feels he has a service to render.
We've talked about Roe v. Wade, and I think some of the folks here at Out and Equal might very well hear all of this talk about that issue and wonder if precedent like that, Roe v. Wade, is in danger of possibly being overturned. What does that mean about civil rights protections for LGBTQ people?
Yeah, I don't think much is the simple answer to the question. I think there are due process justifications for the court's ruling in the marriage case, Obergefell, and Lawrence v. Texas as well. But beyond that, I just don't see any appetite at the court for overturning the marriage ruling. I think there's a sense that that question has been asked and answered and is settled, unlike abortion, which has remained controversial for 50 years. Consider, for example, the latest Gallup poll. It showed that 70% of respondents say that same-sex marriage should be equally as valid as traditional marriage, but public opinion on abortion remains about equally divided. So, I understand sort of the judicial or doctrinal reasons why you ask if Roe v. Wade gets shot down and the Supreme Court says, look, there's no such thing as a right to privacy, that could undercut some of these other rulings in other areas, especially in the gay rights area. I don't see that happening. And remember, one of the more recent victories here in the transgender case and in the Bostock case, the two cases in which Justice Gorsuch said that this federal civil rights law, Title VII, does cover these two areas, that was based on a statutory decision, not on the Constitution.
We've all long heard that bad cases lead to bad law, and that Roe was always one that, well, wasn't very well put together. What's your read been on that as one who studies such things?
Well, remember, one of the first people to say that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Before she got on the court, remember, she was highly critical of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe. And that was one of the reasons why, I mean, it's hard to believe this now, but that many women's groups opposed her nomination, or at least were highly skeptical of it. It's interesting to look at what the Biden Justice Department says in its brief that it gave to the court this week on the Roe question. And what it basically says I'm going to paraphrase it here wildly, is don't look too carefully under the hood. Let's just think about stare decisis. Let's think about the fact that for 50 years, this decision has been woven into the fabric of society. Don't be changing it now. People have come to depend on it. Basically, what the Biden brief says here is, even if you think Roe was wrong, you should not change it for stare decisis reasons. You should not change it because the country has come to depend on it. It's part of life now. It's important to women, and so for that reason, you shouldn't throw it out. So, I think that's going to be a persuasive argument. It won't make any difference to Clarence Thomas, who, by the way, has always consistently said stare decisis means nothing to him. If a case was wrongly decided in the past, the court should junk it. My sense is we're going to see these 3-3-3 splits like we did last term, with the three liberals, the three sort of moderate conservatives of the Chief Justice, Kavanaugh and Barrett, and then the three more conservative justices who may split on Roe.
When the High Court begins its new term coming up in October, which key cases will you be keeping your eyes most closely on?
Well, abortion, of course, is going to be the big one. That's the one that we'll pay most attention to and that will be huge. But also, there's an important case on the meaning of the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled 13 years ago that it does provide an individual right to have a gun at home for self-defense. But then after doing that, the court sort of said, okay, we're out of the gun business. It consistently ducked invitations to say what the Second Amendment means when it speaks of the right to keep and bear arms. You don't think of bearing arms at home, so namely carrying a gun outside the home. And it will get to that issue when it hears a case from New York in November. The state allows residents to carry a concealed handgun only if they get a permit because they can demonstrate some special need, something beyond a general desire for self-protection. And the question is whether a state can require that kind of high step in order to exercise a constitutional right. A couple of other things. The court might take up a challenge to Harvard's use of race as a plus factor, one among many in school admissions. The Supreme Court has upheld the use of race in admissions twice before, but this more conservative court seems unlikely to make it 3 in a row. The court will also decide whether the Boston Marathon bomber, Johar Tsarnaev, should get a new sentencing hearing. This isn't about guilt, this is about the sentence. An appeals court said that the judge didn't give the defense lawyers enough questioning of the jury about news coverage they saw, and the appeals court said that the judge improperly excluded some evidence. And then, of course, we'll be watching toward the end to see if Justice Breyer does retire. As you know, he's been under enormous pressure to step down while the Democrats and the White House have the Senate, and he'll be 84 next June.
I'm interested in that Kerry case, especially the one you mentioned. I guess that's a New York centric.
Yep.
What's the legal read on this, and how would you think that might play out?
Well, I think that the reason that the Supreme Court hasn't taken the gun issue, this issue of the guns outside the house for so many years, because they didn't know where Anthony Kennedy would be. They just didn't know whether he would be a critical fifth vote. So he's gone, and I think with his replacement by Kavanaugh, with Justice Ginsburg's replacement by Barrett, now the court must feel more comfortable about taking this case because it did grant it. The appeals courts have been somewhat divided. I think the real question is, what will the Supreme Court say? Because if you go back to the Heller decision in 2008, the Supreme Court said a couple of things. One is, yes, the Second Amendment is an individual right, settling the issue from once and for all about whether it was for individuals or militias, so we're beyond that now. Yes, you have a right to have a gun in the home for self-defense, but then the Supreme Court also said there are lots of traditional reasons why states can restrict gun ownership in other areas, and why you can say, you can't take a gun into the church and that kind of thing. So the real importance of this gun question, of this gun case, will be, what does the Supreme Court say about when states can properly restrict gun ownership or carrying guns in certain places? What's the new test going to be?
This has been fascinating. Pete, I'm curious for folks who hear it out in Equal who are really interested in learning more about the Supreme Court. What are some resources you'd point them to other than, obviously, your NBC News reporting?
What else is there?
Nothing for me.
CNBC.
Thank you.
Well, let's see. Oh, well, a couple of things. Number one is, we have this unusual ability to listen live to the oral argument. We've had that the last year and a half. We're going to continue to have that at least for the first part of this year. The Supreme Court's own website posts all the documents and all the cases. This is kind of something they've only recently done, but you can log on to the court website, type the name of the case, and you'll get all the briefs on both sides. SCOTUS blog, the blog published by my friend Tom Goldstein, is a great resource as well. They do sort of a live blog on the day that orders and opinions come out. It's a great resource. So, if you're really curious about the Supreme Court, it's possible to sit at home in your jammies now and learn a lot more about it than you used to be able to.
Every time a big case comes along, the chattering classes and people who are particularly interested in the subject at hand make the argument of, why can't we see this? We can see everything else. Why no cameras? Is there still a debate there? And if you want to share, do you have an opinion on it?
Yes, my grandchildren will be dead before the Supreme Court allows cameras in the courtroom.
Okay.
I used to think the reason the justices didn't want it is because they didn't want to be hassled in the salad bar at the Gourmet Giant and be recognized. I truly think that several members of the court feel that if cameras were allowed, it would change the nature of oral argument. Stephen Breyer is a good example of this. He tends to ask these long, tortured, hypothetical questions. Testing, well, what about this? Could it be that? He doesn't necessarily saying that that's what he thinks. And I think the justices think that if that's televised, then the John Olivers of the world and the evening talk shows will pull out a little excerpt and say, aha, this is what Stephen Breyer thinks. So I think on the one hand, they feel that it could change the nature of argument by the lawyers. I must say, I find that completely an unpersuasive argument. I can't believe the lawyers are going to be focused on the justices. Right. They're not going to be thinking about television coverage. I think the justices feel that if it's televised, somehow the nature of their questions will be distorted. And it's a bit of an unfair argument because, of course, if you read the newspaper descriptions of oral argument, only one or two little bits and sentences are quoted. So how would it be different on television? And I guess the answer is it would just have a bigger impact. I just can't see any of the current justices going for television coverage. You
used to hear, there's a Lance Ito effect on here. Nobody wants anything like that. But we've had similar big cases in state courts since then, especially in criminal courts, that have proved that courtrooms can work quite effectively and quite professionally. But I guess that's beside the point entirely.
Yeah, it's one thing in the trial courts. It's different in the appellate courts when you have the judges all actively asking questions, trying things out. I think they just feel that they would be misunderstood. And they also feel, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I've always marveled that you can present the two sides and explain the decisions of the court or the decision not to decide so brilliantly. But can you point to specific cases where what was going on affected you to the point where your own feelings almost crept in? And if so, what those might have been?
Almost crept in. Well, look, I mean, it's out there. It's anybody can see it on YouTube. I got a little choked up in announcing the Obergefell decision. Yeah. It surprised me. I didn't think that was going to happen. What happens when you read the Supreme Court doesn't take easy cases. There's a reason they come to the Supreme Court. It's because they're hard questions. So what you find out generally is that, you sit down and you read the top side briefs and you think, wow, yeah, that's right. And then you read the other side's brief and you think, wow, well, no, that's right too. Well, somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. And, both sides usually present very good arguments, and that's why it is relatively easy in these cases to be, you certainly try to be even-handed. And covering the Obergefell case and the gay marriage cases, which really began with DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, and then the Prop 8 case from California, and then finally Obergefell. we made great efforts to make sure that both sides were presented because, there are people who disagree about this, and it's not our job to pick the winners and losers. That's the Supreme Court's job.
But the Supreme Court had picked it, and then it affected you because...
Well, because I wanted to get married. So, sure. Look, I got a little choked up there and then tried to force my way to get through it. I'm not particularly proud of that moment, but I'm a human being.
I was watching that on a long-awaited...
Or you're the one.
On a long-awaited vacation with my partner, and we happened to be at a beach in France because of the time zone difference, and my partner's younger, but I just thought about all of the struggles for all of this time, and then how future generations will think absolutely nothing of it. And I was overwhelmed. I'm not one to break down in tears about things like that, but that was a teary, exciting day that justice was done, the system worked, and good for you, Supremes. I don't know. I was very excited and glad not to be covering it at the moment, frankly.
Well, I will tell you one thing that was unusual about that day. Usually, when there's a big case like Obamacare or anything else that generates a lot of attention, the abortion cases, there's always a huge crowd that develops outside the court until the decision comes down, and then there's a lot of cheering, and then everybody goes home. Not that day.
No.
People stayed all day until nightfall. It was just like one big long party. It was very unusual.
And then the light up of the White House, which nobody will ever forget.
Yeah, right.
Before we go, you've been doing this for a minute. Is there a particular part of this job? Is there a favorite thing that keeps you coming back and back and back?
Sure. It's that every day, every case is different. Adam Liptak, who is a very gifted reporter who covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times, I was on a panel with him the other day, and he said, the thing about covering the Supreme Court is the longer you do it, the better you get at it. And I don't know whether that's true for me, but I will say this, you always learn something new. And so whether it's about the peculiar folk ways that the Supreme Court works, or some new aspect of the law. So, it's a gift. It's just continuing education. You're always learning something new, and that's what makes it exciting.
For those of you who are watching, it's clear Pete's not working off notes, right? All of this is in Pete's mind, and that's one of the main reasons when I decided to come to this company. I was so excited to be around the wealth of journalistic knowledge and expertise here. But the first night Pete Williams was on my new show, I was a little bit nervous because I've seen anchors over time who, throw in opinion or try to get you to twist things. You don't allow that. So we're all on our P's and Q's. Pete, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you.
Well, you're very kind, Shep. Thank you so much.
Pete Williams, our expert at the Supreme Court, for the chat today. Very grateful. For our friends at Out and Equal, we hope you enjoyed this discussion. I know I did. I mean, it's rare to be able to have 45 minutes with someone who has such breadth and depth of knowledge about such a thing. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did, hearing from Pete about the Supreme Court. And I'll throw it over to MSNBC's Candace Gibson now for more about what NBC News is doing to cover the LGBTQ community. Candace, to you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy that discussion with you and Pete Williams. Hi, everybody. I'm Candace Gibson, a weekend anchor at MSNBC, anchor a show that's on from 6 a.m. till 8 a.m. Eastern Time every weekend. Today, I'm so psyched that we are joined by two awesome people. Brooke Sapelsa, who is a managing editor for NBC Out, which, of course, is our vertical on NBCnews.com, and Joe Yerkeba, who is a reporter for NBC Out. Welcome to both of you. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so should we get right to it, guys?
Let's do it.
Okay, so Brooke, you manage NBC Out, which is a vertical on NBCnews.com. that reports, of course, on LGBTQ plus issues all across America. What is it like being the editor of an NBC News site that's dedicated solely to a queer audience? I mean, is that a big deal in this industry that we have this dedicated platform?
I certainly like to think so. I started my career at NBC, my full-time journalism career back in 2006, and now I'm aging myself, but I started at CNBC. When I started at CNBC, I was actually not even out at work. And then I sort of tiptoed out of the closet at work by joining NBC's LGBTQ employee network. And I eventually went on to lead NBC's LGBTQ employee network. But even during my first years at NBC, I never imagined that NBC News would have its own LGBTQ vertical. So I left NBC for a while, not because it didn't have its own vertical, but I just happened to leave, went to the HuffPost for a few years, and then was asked to come back and launch NBC Out in mid-2016. So it was just for me personally, coming back to where I started my career was very important, but also as someone who had always been passionate about LGBTQ issues, to be able to merge my professional and personal passions was deeply rewarding. But when I first launched NBC Out, our first day live was June 1st, 2016. And less than 2 weeks later, we had the Pulse massacre, where 49 innocent, mainly LGBTQ people were killed in South Florida. And, ever since, really since the first day we launched, but certainly since Pulse, it seems like it has been nonstop LGBTQ coverage. There's never shortage of an LGBTQ story. And it's as true today as it was in June 2016. I always say my hardest decision that I have to make every day is what we don't have the bandwidth to cover, because there has been so much LGBTQ news. So, it's great to lead this section. We are one of the most popular verticals on NBCnews.com, and it's certainly busy. We'd like to cover everything from pop culture to politics. And, it's been a real honor to be able to do this at NBC, where I started my career.
And is there, curious, is there an aspect of that's more popular than others, or is there a letter in the alphabet, in our alphabet, that is more popular, the LGBTQ plus more stories, or it all depends?
You know what? I'm going to say it all depends. But I had actually had one of our data analytics folks do a sort of bar chart for me for the L, the G, the B, the T, and the Q, and which articles that had any of those words, or LGBTQ was on that chart too, were the most popular. So the first time he did it for me, the word lesbian was the most popular. Anytime the word lesbian was in a headline, it showed that articles outperformed. But most recently, when they did that for me, so it wasn't cumulative. The last time they did it for me, it was over, I think, the previous 4 months. The word transgender was the most popular. So I'm going to say it depends.
And perhaps maybe it's evolved a little bit along with our own mindset and nationally, or the national outlook. Who knows? Joe, I want to bring you in on all of this, and picking up specifically on the T, trans. What sort of trends have you noticed nationally, and how troubling are some of those trends that you've noticed when it comes to that community?
Yeah. So one of the biggest trends I reported on this year, I started with NBC Out in January, and one of the biggest trends I reported on is the number of states that have introduced bills that target trans people, and specifically trans young people. So, almost 30 states have introduced bills that seek to prohibit trans athletes from participating on school sports teams that align with their gender identity. And then 2 states, Arkansas and Tennessee, have passed laws that restrict or ban certain kinds of gender affirming care for transgender minors. And advocates say that these issues are sort of coming to the forefront because they've sort of become like the last frontier for LGBTQ plus rights, and are really a strong wedge issue after conservatives lost the fight against marriage equality. And they also, really rely on the fact that a majority of Americans don't have an understanding of trans people or trans healthcare, even though, surveys have more recently told us that more people than ever before know a trans person. So it's kind of created this perfect storm that has allowed these bills to flourish, just like the lack of understanding that a lot of Americans have when it comes to trans people, and sort of this like last push that we're seeing from the conservatives in terms of, trying to restrict LGBTQ rights.
And I've noticed also, and I don't know how much reporting you've done on it, Joe, and it's becoming a very prevalent issue when it comes to trans rights within prison. How big of an issue that is that right now?
The Seventh Circuit Court decided that trans people should be housed according to their gender identity and not their sex assigned at birth. But I know that in states, state law really affects whether, that's actually the practice. And then we're seeing more and more cases recently related to whether trans people can access certain healthcare while they're in prison. So that's definitely an issue that has recently been in the news a lot more, for sure.
Yeah, no doubt, indeed. Brooke, let's start, because we're still pretty much doing all of this during a pandemic. Yes, we're getting out there a little bit more, but as you're managing so many people and you're trying to cover different stories all over the country, all over the world for that matter, how do you handle it and do this sort of reporting and coverage through the pandemic?
Well, luckily, in addition to, and sorry, you probably can see, I've got one of my two dogs with me in this panel. One of the great things about our team is, in addition to having in-staff reporters and journalists like Joe, whose work has been absolutely phenomenal, we also have a great group of external contributors. So, we're not just getting ideas from folks that are, NBC staffers, but we really have people across the country and some international contributors that share ideas for stories with us. And I think that makes our coverage so much richer because we have, so many great journalists pitching us excellent stories. And, just in terms of the pandemic, we've done a number of stories about how the pandemic is uniquely impacting LGBTQ folks. One story we did early on in the pandemic was about how gender affirming surgeries had been postponed because they were not considered essential. And we had a freelancer who is a trans journalist herself, spoke to a number of trans people who were unable to have their surgeries and had already scheduled surgeries postponed, and how that really upended their lives. I mean, everyone's life was upended because of the pandemic. But this particular journalist talked to trans folks who explained how they were uniquely impacted by having these long-awaited surgeries postponed and not knowing when they would be able to actually have their affirming surgeries. So that was one story in particular that I thought was very powerful that we covered in the early days of the pandemic. Also, we covered what was happening with lesbian bars. Even prior to the pandemic, we had 20 or less lesbian bars left across the US, and this is down from hundreds. And many of the remaining lesbian bars shared with one of our freelancers, Julie Compton, who's been writing for NBC Out since literally the first day we started. Lesbian bar owners were telling Julie about how they didn't know if they'd be able to survive the pandemic. Many of them had to close down. Some of them are still closed down because of the pandemic. And a number of them were starting fundraisers, many of them on GoFundMe, just to try to, raise the funds to keep their spaces, to be able to pay their staff. So, and I believe at least one of those bars did close during the pandemic, though, in a silver lining, we've had at least one open up since the pandemic.
Okay.
So that has been that's been a silver lining. We also covered Black-owned gay bars during the pandemic. There are not many of those left across the US. So, we spoke to owners of a couple of those bars about how they were faring. And, we have had specific stories about the economic impact that the COVID-19 crisis has taken on LGBTQ people. And, one thing that we found just looking at the LGBTQ community specifically was folks that are part of the LGBTQ community and other marginalized communities, how they were sort of hit twice as hard. So we've kind of been covering this crisis from all different angles.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. I know here in New York City, there's a popular chain of bars called Boxers. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with it, but they had one right in the heart of Hell's Kitchen with great outdoor space. So they could have done dining and drinking during the pandemic with really hot bartenders in Boxers, hence the name. And they were not able to survive. You don't know the economics of the places, but just looking at it and saying, if they're not able to survive, then of course you understand why so many of these outlets are going under business. But there have been a few that have been reopened, and it's great to hear that there was at least one lesbian bar that opened during it. Joe, let's talk about
actually, you know what? I'm going to restate that. There is at least one that will be opening. I don't know if it's actually been open yet. So,
okay.
So I'll just backtrack on that. I'm not sure that it's officially open yet.
All right. Well, it's still a glimmer of hope. We'll take it.
Exactly.
Joe, let's talk about the global pandemic as well with you and covering it. What would it say for you as a reporter? What does it take to be able to report during the pandemic?
Well, I think for me, it's really come down to like creating and leveraging like an online network. And I think, during journalism school, they would send us out onto campus and be like, go find a story and come back and write it. And I think that now journalism, but especially during the pandemic, just looks way different than that. And so for me, it's been a lot of, creating relationships with like grassroots groups or with like the parents of trans kids in these states where these bills have passed, and trying to keep those relationships with them like online, whether that's like through Twitter or just like texting them regularly. And so that's like really been a challenge that I haven't really encountered so much before. And that's what I've been really focused on doing, is just trying to connect with people through Twitter, connect with, lawyers at the ACLU or whatever other legal groups I'm working with to try to get them to connect me with folks online. So for me, things have definitely shifted a lot more away from, going places or like having, these great aspirational reporting trips where I get to go somewhere and talk to people, and more of, how can I actually connect with people through like different online resources like Twitter.
Yeah, and we've all had to find different ways to do all of this. Brooke, I want to ask you about this, about covering trans kids, because we had a big debate, I believe it was earlier this year, when we interviewed an 8-year-old girl from Texas. And there were many of us in our staff, and many on our staff, including myself, are LGBTQ plus members, where we thought it's a little too young to be able to interview someone like that who believes and knows and thinks that she was born a girl and has felt that she was that way since kindergarten. How do you decide if you can give a platform for someone that's that young when it's such a delicate thing?
Well, first, we would always go through their parent first and get permission. And typically what we'll do at NBC News Digital is have the parent actually be in the conversation. So, and Joe's probably better to answer this question, but I'll kick it off in terms of the ethics behind it. But Joe has built an absolutely incredible reputation with many folks in the trans community, particularly trans youth, as being someone who will report on the issue responsibly. So we would always ask a minor's parent permission, and then we would actually try to have that parent, and through the pandemic, everything has primarily been by phone or webcam when we're interviewing folks, but we would typically have their parent be in the conversation, And we would do that for any minor, especially a minor as young as, let's say, 8 years old.
Yeah.
But I think, as someone who's assigning these stories, it's also important to make sure that the person who will be talking to this young person, whether they're a trans young person or cisgender young person, to make sure that the person who's actually doing the interviewing has the empathy and the knowledge to properly and empathetically interview this person. And I could say without hesitation that Joe is one of those people, and Joe has built a great amount of trust within the trans community, especially. So I'll toss it to you, Joe, because I know you've done many of these interviews and have built that trust.
Yeah, it's definitely like really sensitive, especially when the subjects are younger. And I think for me, like Brooke mentioned, it's a matter of making sure that the parents are looped in and are a part of the conversation, or if it's related to a lawsuit of some kind, usually their legal team is also on the phone. So it's a very like collaborative sort of approach, but it's also just recognizing that these young people, even though they are young, they know what their truth is. And I think there's a sort of tendency, people want to say that, kids are going through phases, they're figuring things out, which I absolutely think is true. But I think that with trans young people in particular, I just try to really be clear with them that, I recognize that they have agency and they know who they are. And I sort of just take that at face value. And that's sort of where I start those conversations.
Understood. Thank you, guys. Yeah, and her parent, her mom, was a part of the interview, but her dad is suing. So it was a little bit of they're caught in custody, a custody situation. As you can understand, with these situations, it's pretty delicate. Let's talk about the 40th anniversary of the first HIV/AIDS case in the United States. Brooke, what stood out to you? What surprised you in doing that coverage?
Well, NBC News was not just NBC News Digital, which NBC Out is a part of. We had coverage across NBC News.
Yeah.
One thing that really struck me, and I just rewatched Joe Fryer's excellent package on the 40-year anniversary. And one thing that really struck me is the difference in the way that reporters were covering the crisis 40 years ago and today. And just seeing the lack of empathy that many folks, even including those in our own network, had at the time toward particularly gay men who were living with HIV. And seeing our latest coverage, and I'm going to reference Joe Fryer's particular package on the 40-year anniversary, seeing an openly gay man covering this topic with such an incredible level of empathy, juxtaposed to our own reporting 40 years ago, where we were talking about homosexual lifestyles, contributing to HIV. And just what struck me as a pretty tone deaf and callous way to cover such a tragedy. That really did stick out to me. And also in our coverage, we always like to have folks who were impacted by a certain situation, in this case, HIV. So talking to long-term survivors of HIV, speaking to doctors who were, on the front lines at the time. So, within our 40-year anniversary coverage, and just for those who are not aware of the context, it was 40 years since the first public reports of HIV. So it was 40 years since, I believe it was the CDC was the government agency that first published a report. And to always have people who have a stake in every issue. And when it comes to HIV, we've done this not just for the 40-year anniversary, but also all of our HIV coverage. We try to make sure that folks who are personally affected have a voice in the story. So, that's something that has been important to us. But really, one of the things that struck me the most was the difference in just the reporting on the crisis. And the lack of empathy and today's sort of, at least the way NBC has been covering it. I haven't seen, I didn't look at everyone's coverage, but the way NBC just covered the topic with such empathy, that really struck me.
Yeah, I noted that in Joe's reporting. I was also watching a documentary on the Central Park Five, and during the coverage on network news, it was, even though the N-word was used, and even though it was part of the court hearing, it was just shocking that was part of the news reporting at the time.
So we actually did a number of stories tied to the 40-year anniversary of the first reports of HIV, and Joe collaborated with NBC News Now on a multimedia package. Joe, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So I helped write a companion piece for a short documentary about what HIV looks like now, 40 years later. And I think one of the things that struck me the most, it's not really surprising, but it always really strikes me, is just the amount of stigma there still is surrounding HIV and diagnoses of HIV. I mean, even, today in 2021, there are people who said that, their friends and family still thought that if they touched them, they could contract HIV. So there's this really persistent stigma. And even still, there are advocates that, are speaking out in their communities to try to fight that, because, stigma is what plays a role in people not getting care for HIV, not getting diagnosed and things like that. So I think that always sticks out to me, is just the amount of stigma people are fighting, and the fact that despite that, they still come out and are trying to, support people living with HIV.
Is it important to come out as HIV positive?
I think that activists would say yes. I actually did another panel related to this where people said that there's a double standard for LGBTQ people living with HIV, where they sort of have to have this second coming out as I'm living with HIV. And it's both due to, this idea that when you are LGBTQ plus and you are living with HIV, that it's quote unquote your fault, and that you did something, it's related to your actions. And for Black people in particular living with HIV, there's also an element of racism there as well. So I think that activists, think that it's important to come out and, be open if you're living with HIV, but it's definitely this standard. There's a double standard there, because we don't see as many straight people who sort of have these big coming out moments about, the fact that they're living with HIV.
Yeah.
And I would say in terms of reporting on people with HIV, I would certainly never, I think it's someone's personal decision whether or not they wanted to, come out publicly. So just like I would never, out someone as part of the queer community if they had an issue with that, and some people still do, unless it was relevant to the story and someone, specifically was talking from they wanted to include that they were HIV positive or living with HIV in a story and it was relevant to the story, we of course wouldn't include that information if it was not their choice.
Absolutely. I understand that. Hey, let's get to a couple of audience submitted questions for both of you right now. Submitted folks here at Out and Equal. First to Joe. We have a question here about the Equality Act that is currently making its way through Congress, as you know, if you can say that it's making its way through Congress. It's been there for a while. What do you think the chances of getting the Equality Act passed now? And what do you believe are the obstacles of getting it passed?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I have a lot of hope. A lot of advocates that I've spoken with say that it's really about public pressure, that if there were more public pressure to pass it, then there would be fewer obstacles, or it would have a better chance. But I think the main obstacles, if you watched the Senate hearing for the Equality Act, a lot of it focused on trans people and, whether trans people having protection from discrimination in public spaces or in sports would hurt the rights specifically of girls and women. And so I think there's a lot of, I mentioned earlier, misinformation and just misunderstanding of trans people and their healthcare and just who they are as people. And I think that is playing a huge role in terms of obstacles for the Equality Act.
Okay, and to Brooke, to you, this audience submitted a question about the intersex community. Sorry, this one is insisting on being a co-star here.
I've got another co-star as well.
How can media and LGBTQ plus legal organizations help shine a light on intersex stories and help make them a little bit more visible?
So I'm proud of the reporting that NBC Out has done on the intersex community. And, I'd love to do even more stories centering on intersex folks. But I would say an important thing, when it comes to our coverage on intersex people specifically, as with, other communities within the LGBTQ community, is to always have an intersex perspective in those stories. We try to steer clear of just having experts who are not part of that specific community, whether it's intersex folks, trans people, lesbians, without having people who are part of that specific section of our community. So I would say with our coverage, we have covered, there are certain healthcare facilities and hospitals that are no longer performing intersex surgeries on infants. We've covered those stories. We've covered, stories about queer joy, about intersex people that are making a difference. And, anytime we do cover a story specifically related to intersex folks, we feel it's our obligation to make sure that there are intersex voices within that story. So, I would say for us, and, if folks that are watching, if you have a story idea and you feel that you're not seeing it covered, I would encourage you to email us at nbcout@nbcuni, or email me directly at brooke@nbc.com. We are dependent to an extent on people within the community speaking up and reaching out to us if they feel that there's an issue that's not getting proper coverage. But I would say for our coverage in particular, we always make sure that we have voices of people who are directly impacted by a particular issue represented in any particular story.
Have you had people who aren't part of the community raise their hand and said, "I want to do this story"?
You mean in terms of covering it or speaking about a particular issue?
Or covering it.
Of course, while I don't write as much as Joe does on particularly editing and assigning stories, I've had to write stories about every corner of our community. Joe identifies as trans non-binary and has written their fair share of stories about gay men, lesbians.
No, but I mean, like straight colleagues who aren't necessarily working for you, who just
who are not necessarily part of our broader community.
Our broader community.
Oh, yeah. Sure. And I actually think that it's, I was a business news reporter for a while. I've reported on, topics that really covered the spectrum of news, of general news. So, and Joe and I are only two people. NBC Out is two people full time, though we do have a lot of freelancers that are, excellent and help us kind of, I think, get the best LGBTQ coverage possible. But we have a breaking news team, and we have folks in London. NBC News Digital is, there's someone at the, someone steering the ship 24/7. So Joe and I can't always be on, and there's queer breaking news that happens when, we're both sleeping or it's our, enjoying our weekend. So we have colleagues that are not necessarily part of our community that are covering, important LGBTQ issues when we're not on. And I think that's great. And for the most part, our colleagues have done an excellent job covering queer issues. So, it would just be impossible for us. I mean, I don't want to get calls in the middle of the night unless it's, I did when I first started, for example, and Pulse happened, I did get a call in the middle of the night from my boss at the time. But for the most part, I'm not getting called in the middle of the night or on the weekend, unless it's like a really major story that, the editorial director needs to be aware of. But our colleagues have done a fine job. And I like to think that NBC News more broadly, that our colleagues, whether they be part of the queer community or not, for the most part, know how to report on our issues, particularly if it's a breaking news story and it's, something that needs to get up quickly. Pete Buttigieg and his husband announced that they're having twins, that, if that happens when we're not online, they can cover that. So I also think that it's helpful that NBC Out has been a resource to NBC News more broadly. Joe and I, and Joe really took the lead on this, created a document for our standards team about reporting on issues pertaining to the trans and non-binary community. And this is a document that's available to our standards team, which they're kind of like the NBC News ethics team, but it's also available to folks across NBC News. So if, another team is reporting, let's say the Today Show is reporting on, the trans community, they have access to that document, which includes best practices.
Joe, really quickly as we wrap up here, what's an exciting story that you're looking forward to reporting on?
I think, I guess a big picture sort of thing I'm just looking forward to reporting on more is just the increasing number of trans people, doing exciting, positive, like joyful things. I think an example I've been pointing to a lot recently is there's a group of people in Massachusetts who started this clinic called Trans Health Northampton. And they're a trans-run, owned and operated clinic that provides holistic, comprehensive healthcare to trans people. And it's one of the first independent clinics of its kind doing this. And I think that it's sort of like a real signal that now we're seeing, positive, joyful, like trans experiences more often. And that's something I think I'm really looking forward to highlighting as we go forward, particularly, in light of all of these bills that we're seeing at the state level that are sort of a pushback to that increasing visibility of trans people.
That's great. And really love that you guys are covering all of this, and really appreciate the work that you, Brooke, and Joe are doing, and your entire team. And thank you for being part of this discussion. Thank you, guys. And the dogs I see have all made their way somewhere else into different parts of the room. Thank you all. And thank you for watching, by the way, Out and Equal and NBC News, our NBC News Summit. I hope that we can see you all again someday soon. Be well. Take care.
Thanks all.
Thank you.